Hello, everybody. I'm John O'Loughlin. Welcome to McDuff Lives. Well, I haven't done a Mindfields, and I think back in early July was the last one. I've been very, very concentrated on my Undo the Coup and a lot of other interesting shows we've done with our great guests. I am thrilled to have this platform and to be able to share the wisdom and knowledge that I've gained over my lifetime. And I majored in government, American government, in College of William and Mary. I have a law degree, and I have always loved the idea of studying American history, American law, political philosophy. And I think no time is more important than now to go back and remind ourselves, what were they fighting for? What did the American patriots mean by liberty? Welcome once again, everyone, to my McDuff's Mindfields number 293. Wow, what a journey it has been. Well, today I'm going back to my roots and actually America's roots, and to discover once again together, if you will, the idea of liberty and why we fought for it and what is at stake today. Because it is that concept of liberty that we, our forefathers, fought for, and foremothers, forgive me, what they fought for is what we are standing in line to lose. If you recall George Orwell's famous quote, if you want to know what the future looks like, a future with no curiosity, a future in which you can best picture it by picturing a boot stomping on the human neck forever. And that should be a warning to us. That's what Orwell was trying to do, was to say, you have something very precious, but if you lose it, it's gone forever. So what is it? What is this liberty that we claim to cherish? Some of us would say, give me liberty or give me death. And I think there are a number of American patriots today that would rise up, as the song says, and, fight for it. But the pressures on American liberty are plentyfold and very, very powerful. And of course, I've learned to look to the British Empire as the source of those pressures. It's not the only source, European powers too, but look at the 7 Years' War, 1756 or 7 to 1763? That was a big fight between two imperial powers, two very different imperial powers. The commercial power, represented by Britain, and the ancient empire power, represented by France. And they fought it out for 7 years until Great Britain finally won. But they were left with a lot of debt. And that, I think, is where we can start the story today. I want to call on Professor James Vaughn of the University of Chicago to introduce this idea. And I'm going to skip his introduction. This show is on YouTube. It is called The British East India Company and the Tea Act. And I encourage you to watch the whole thing. I'm going to share some large selected portions of it, just because, as I've always said, if somebody else has already done the writing, done the work, done the production, there's no need for me to do it from scratch. So let's tune in now to Professor James Vaughn. He is speaking in Washington, D.C. at the headquarters of the Society of the Cincinnati. Dumbarton Oaks, Georgetown, Washington, D.C., a place I've been to many times.
About a little over 250 years ago, the British Parliament passed, and King George III gave his assent.
I'm sorry, I'm just going to interrupt to let you know that I'm playing it on 1.5 speed, so he sounds a little clipped in his presentation, but I think it's worthwhile. You can understand him.
To an act which has come known to us as the Tea Act, and it was dealing with a practical problem in British imperial affairs. The gentleman pictured here on the left, Lord North, was the Prime Minister of Great Britain from 1770 to 1782. And essentially, he faced a huge practical problem. His government, which was in power when the Tea Act was passed in May 1773, faced a huge problem, which was a crisis in the British East India Company's affairs. The British East India Company was not simply Britain's leading corporation, it was the world's leading corporation. And by this point in 1773, it had become responsible for maintaining an empire in northeastern India that included 20 million largely peasant Muslim and Hindu Bengalis. It had a vast empire in northeastern India. What's more, it was a key player in the British public debt and the British state, meaning it wasn't simply a private corporation. It was a major lender to government debt, and therefore it was a major public creditor. And it also played one of the most important roles on the London stock market. So it was deeply embedded in both the public fiscal and the private financial life of the nation. And
all right, I'm going to stop here, and just because I want to make this parallel to look what's going on today. Our economy is run by mega corporations, worldwide corporations, over which our voters and our Congress really have little power. If you see how our Congress is used for the benefit of those existing great piles of wealth that are represented in corporate form and have got the Supreme Court to give them rights of personhood, then you can see that this is exactly what happened when the British East India Company took over so many large former kingdoms in India. And this was not lost on the founding fathers.
By the early 1770s, the British East India Company had gone bankrupt, and it was overwhelmed with tea sitting in its storehouses in London. Traditionally, it had to sell that tea at auction to tea dealers that would then go on and export that tea to Europe, to the Americas, to elsewhere. But because of the East India Company's bankruptcy, or looming bankruptcy, and because of the threat that posed not just to the biggest multinational corporation in the world, but to the British Empire in Bengal, to British public credit, and to British private finance, it was necessary for the government to step in and find some way to prevent the company from failing. The solution that the Ministry of Lord North comes to is essentially to allow the company to directly export its tea from China to North America, meaning the tea that exists in London in warehouses will no longer be sold to tea dealers and tea merchants, but rather the British East India Company will be able to directly export itself its tea to colonial North America, which it hadn't been allowed to do before. Furthermore, the government decides to remove the export duty, that is the duty that British East India Company ships would have to pay when they depart from Britain. They decide to remove that duty. Although on the other end, once those ships cross the Atlantic, they will, in colonial American ports, have to pay the duty on tea, the Townshend duty on tea, which is the sole remaining duty still in place from the Townshend Acts. It's not clear why such legislation would trigger a profound crisis in Anglo-American affairs, indeed the final crisis, would render the British Atlantic world asunder in the American Revolution. Now, obviously, first there's the matter of tea, but as I've already raised the issue, that is connected to the matter of taxes, because not only is the British East India Company being given duty-free export from Britain to colonial North America, but tea that ships to colonial North America will have to pay the Townshend duty on tea, which is the one remaining duty, as I've already mentioned, that was put in place by the Townshend Acts in 1767 and 1768. This is a form of taxation raised by Parliament that the colonial American resistance movement claims Parliament doesn't have the right to raise. So the payment of the Townshend duty in colonial British North America raises this vexed question of taxation. Does a Parliament that doesn't represent in any actual sense the colonists in British North America have the right to tax them, either directly or indirectly? So tea raises the issue of taxes. But taxes is not really, I would argue, the issue of fundamental importance. It is, of course, a necessary but not sufficient condition. Why? Because by the early 1770s, the colonial population of British North America has experienced the most dynamic social and economic development in world history prior to the Industrial Revolution. The colonists, that is the free colonists, the colonists beyond the slave plantations in the early 1770s, have a per capita income higher than Great Britain. They have greater purchasing power than the average person in Great Britain, which had been the wealthiest country in the world for much of the 18th century. And they're essentially very lightly taxed, very prosperous. They have high degrees of political participation, political inclusion. Why is it that some relatively minor taxes, the Townsend duty on tea, or indeed all of the Townsend duties, would raise these issues? Why is it that basically an extremely lightly taxed, lightly regulated, extremely prosperous, politically enfranchised colonial settler population would decide to take up arms against some relatively light duties on imports into the colonies, and ultimately against one single duty, this duty on tea? It all makes sense to us because we know how it played out, but I want to sort of consider it from a different angle, which is how strange it seems that such well-off socially and economically, such prosperous, such lightly taxed, such lightly regulated, such politically free settlers would rise up. Now, I'm not going to try and be a kind of revisionist historian that says there's no there. I do think there were incredible vital issues at stake. But I think sometimes if we merely focus on taxation and don't strongly link it to the issue of representation, and we don't have a good enough understanding of what those two things mean when we link them, taxation and representation, we lose a sense of why the colonists thought this was a vital issue. They thought literally, as they said time and time again, it was an issue of freedom versus slavery. That is the language that John Dickinson uses. He was a moderate leader of the colonial American resistance movement. That is the language that Thomas Jefferson uses. He was a radical leader of the colonial American resistance movement. Why does every wing of the colonial American resistance movement think that standing up against a relatively light duty on tea and against the East India Company being able to directly import tea to colonial North America is a matter of freedom versus slavery? It can seem a bit exaggerated to us in those terms, but I think if we put it in its proper 18th century context, and we understand that what's meant by freedom is really a new form of civil society that developed first in the British Atlantic world, and that what's meant by slavery is essentially the undoing of that new form of civil society, then we'll have a better understanding of what's at stake in this question of tea and taxes.
Okay, so I just want to make a comment. This is where the meat of what I wanted to present today comes, and that is, what exactly were the colonists enjoying that they called liberty, that they saw was going to be taken away from them if they did not oppose the Tea Act? And I want to just introduce it by saying, number one, we all look at the Bill of Rights and we say that's what distinguishes us, because we have all of these individual rights. But that's not what Professor Vaughan is centering his argument on. And I think he's absolutely right, that what they had was something called civil society. And he's going to describe it for us here, but you know what I mean, that you can form a club, that you can start a new religion, that you can go out and discover something nobody's ever seen before. You can have freedom of travel. You can do all kinds of things that you, in your history, you never could have done before. And it all developed for the very first time on the East Coast of what will become the United States. So let's let Professor Vaughan speak about it.
So that is the introduction. Let me now go back a long way. Let's go back to the first decades of the 18th century. This is a picture of London as we approach the mid-18th century. It is already by far the largest city in Europe. It's almost double the size of Paris, approaching 1 million inhabitants. It's the third largest city in the world after Tokyo and Beijing. But this London pictured here, and the Thames and all of its ships and its imports and exports, is simply the epicenter of a really new development in world history. What do I mean by that, a new development in world history? Well, for about 1,000 years, for a millennia, Western Europe had been ensconced in feudalism. That is, the European Middle Ages were organized around feudalism. And at the heart of the feudal system was unfree labor, that is serfdom, a kind of bonded labor, and a subsistence economy organized around subsistence agriculture. And so the Western Europe that understood itself as Christendom or Latin Christendom for 1,000 years in the Middle Ages had a very distinct form of social and economic organization that we can roughly call feudalism. Due to a number of changes that I don't have time to go into, but by the early 16th century, the whole European medieval feudal system had been sent into a profound crisis. To make a long story very, very short, there is something historians refer to as the general crisis of the 14th and 15th century, where you get a great deal of harvest failures. The Black Death, the bubonic plague, sweeps throughout Europe, taking out somewhere between 30 to 50% of the population. You have the collapse of serfdom. You have the collapse of unfree labor, and peasants broadly get their freedom across the western half of Europe. That is, if you look at Europe west of the Elbe River, by and large, the direct producers, the peasants, largely get their freedom. Then in the late 15th century, you get the two great phenomenon of the age of discovery and exploration. The Portuguese round the southern tip of Africa, the Cape of Good Hope, and create a direct maritime passage between Europe and Asia, much more strongly linking the old world for Europeans, bringing Asia, Africa, and Europe into much more regular commercial and maritime contact. And then a few years later, of course, even more famously, Christopher Columbus crosses the Atlantic and leads to the European discovery of the Americas, which brings into being a whole new series of processes and events and exchanges that form what we now call the Atlantic world. And so these developments, the direct maritime passage between Europe and Asia and the discovery of the Americas, incredibly increases phenomenon that had already been developing in Western Europe. Meaning by the 15th century, serfdom had collapsed in Western Europe and unfree laborers had become free laborers. They become free peasants or free laborers in the towns and cities. And you began to see a slow development of a more commercial economy. With the discovery of the direct maritime passage to Asia and the Americas, you have a radical increase in commercialization. You have a radical increase in people working less and less in subsistence agriculture and more commercial agriculture. You have a radical increase of the movement of free laborers away from the countryside into towns, market villages, manufacturing centers, cities, where they take up jobs as wage laborers. You have the development of a complex division of labor. This gives rise increasingly to new forms of manufacturing cooperation, all of which will lead to the Industrial Revolution by the later 18th century. But essentially, just to wrap all of that up, if you take the collapse of serfdom, the collapse of feudalism, the discovery of the direct maritime passage between Europe and Asia, the discovery of the Americas, the breakup of Christendom with the Protestant Reformation, all of these developments essentially witness the collapse of a feudal society and the rise of a commercial society. And at the core of commercial society is the idea. Of course, there are still great inequalities of wealth. There are still incredible hierarchies. There are still incredible caste and social stratification. But now the direct producers in Western Europe, the common laborers, have become free. They can increasingly set the course of their own existence. They may still be a quite poor peasant farmer, but they can decide, if I want to work harder and smarter and make enough of a surplus, it won't go to a feudal lord anymore. It will remain to me. And I can sell it for goods and equipment, and I can reinvest back in my plot of land and improve. Or I can go off into the town and get a job in growing manufacturing industry, in glassware, in metalware, in the woolen cloth manufacture, in the new textiles, the mixture of wool with silk and cotton. I mean, I could go on endlessly, but basically we can see slowly across the 1500s, the 1600s, into the 1700s, the ripple effects of common everyday working people just being able increasingly to set the course of their own life by deciding how they want to spend their labor, what they want to spend their day doing, what they want to devote their surplus to, what they want to exchange it for, who they want to associate with. And this eventually, by the 18th century in Western Europe, gives rise to civil society. What I simply mean by civil society is effectively that non-state world where people go out in public and they participate in public life collectively with other people, but they do so consensually. The state is based on coercion. You have to do this, you can't do this, right? Private life, family life is within the domestic household. A whole new public life comes into being in Western Europe by the early 18th century, where people freely associate and exchange and work and produce goods and services in the big cities, the small cities, the middling-sized towns, even in the villages when commercial farmers come into the exchanges to trade their foodstuffs and raw materials. There's increasing social interaction, social relations, social congress, intercourse between people. People are creating new associations, civic associations. People are meeting at coffee houses. More pamphlets and newspapers are being produced and debated and discussed. This whole world of civil society is coming into being, and it's come into being nowhere more thoroughly than in the British Isles, particularly in England, and London is at the epicenter of it. It's driving London's incredible growth in the 18th century. Now, effectively, Britain oversees what could be called an empire of liberty. What do I mean by that empire of liberty? I don't mean that there is an incredible violence and oppression in their empire. By the early 18th century, British men and women understand themselves to have an empire of liberty overseas because they believe it to be distinct from the empires of old, the empires of conquest, the Babylonian Empire, the Persian Empire, the Roman Empire, or more contemporaneously, the Spanish Empire, where essentially you send out legions to conquer well-settled agricultural civilizations and you rule over them directly. So the view of most British men and women is that the empire they've created overseas by the early decades of the 18th century is not an empire of conquest when you send out vast armies to conquer foreign populations and rule over them, like the Persians did or the Romans did or the Spanish did, but rather.
And I just want to make a note, from our studies of the Vietnam War, that's exactly what was happening to Vietnam. You had a peasant nation, an economy, self-sufficient, living their lives independently without any foreign exchange, foreign commerce, and certainly without the presence of foreign armies. But this is an indication of how that corporate system has continued to fester in the world. And when we participate in the Vietnam War, we're participating in the reversion of humanity back to a feudal system, which I think in more common language of today would be called fascism.
It's an empire devoted to two things: commerce, that is seaborne trade with the peoples of the world, and of course you will use coercion, the Royal Navy, to maintain your ships and your goods. And it is also an empire of colonial settlement, meaning you will either take land that is not occupied, or you will expropriate, you will dispossess the indigenous people and send your own settlers there to create governments, to create new societies, new governments with plantation agriculture that produces things, staple products not available back in Britain. So the view here is not, I don't mean to suggest just simply to endorse their view they have an empire of liberty, but I'm trying to get at the rational kernel of it. They do not think they've conquered other peoples, in the sense, of course, they're dispossessing indigenous peoples. That's how they're acquiring land in North America. Of course, Britain becomes the leader of the West African slave trade. That involves incredible coercion. But in their self-understanding, they, unlike ancient Persia, unlike ancient Rome, unlike Spain, have not gone out with armies, conquered large civilizations, and subjected them to their rule. Rather, they're basically using coercion either to trade with other societies or to set up colonial plantation settlements with their own immigrants. Okay? And that's why they come to understand themselves to have an empire of liberty. And essentially, by the middle of the 18th century, by the 1750s, there are two arenas in that empire of liberty. The minor arena is the British Asian world. The British Asian world is dominated by the British East India Company, a monopoly joint stock mercantile corporation with a board of directors and shareholders headquartered in Leadenhall Street in London, that plies a trade around the southern tip of Africa, around the Cape of Good Hope, all over the Asian world, to many different Asian ports and many different Asian waters. And by the mid-18th century, the British East India Company has become the biggest multinational corporation in the world and one of the most important elements in the British public debt and in the London stock market. And the British East India Company does not go out to Asia and conquer. It tried to, in the late 17th century, it tried to have an argument with the Nawab of Bengal, and it failed spectacularly. Why? Because in South Asia, in India, its main area of operation, there's a very powerful polity, the Mughal Empire, that can easily defeat any European that tries to interfere in the affairs of the Mughal Empire. And as a result, the British East India Company largely focuses on seaborne trade with coastal settlements that they establish. This is a picture of Madras, or what is today known as Chennai, on the eastern coast of India, the southeastern coast of India. And essentially, that's a picture of the Fort St. George, that the British East India Company erects. Within it is its mercantile factory, meaning it's clerks, it's merchants responsible for buying goods from Indian producers, weavers, spinners, manufacturers, etc., and then bringing them into the town and waiting for these various ships to arrive from Europe and loading them up and going back. So by and large, British imperial activity in the Asian world in the mid-18th century is a monopoly joint stock corporation conducting a seaborne maritime trade along coastal Asia at places like Madras, pictured here. The other, and by far the major arena of British imperial activity by the mid-18th century, is the British Atlantic world. Okay, the British Atlantic world was forged by the mixture of indigenous societies, West Africans who were brought over through coerced immigration, transatlantic slavery, and Western European immigrants, forging a new Atlantic world throughout the 16th, 17th, 18th century. And Great Britain has become the leading player in that world by the mid-18th century. Pictured here, I'm sorry if you can't see the dot, but this is obviously eastern seaboard colonial North America. The dark green is highly settled areas with very well-developed commercial agriculture, whether those are family farms or slave plantations or larger estates. Towns and cities, you have Savannah, you have Charleston, you have obviously places like Philadelphia, Boston, New York, Newport, et cetera, but not those places. You also have a system of towns internally connecting them to the western frontier. And then obviously you see how they're pushing out westward, right? The very light green is the farthest push west. Now, I want to stress something about British Atlantic world that is extremely important, which is to say, because there's no direct conquest of a pre-existing civilization, such as the Spanish conquered Aztec Mexico or Inca Peru, because rather you're either going where there isn't much indigenous settlement or you're expropriating lands from indigenous people, you essentially have no pre-existing social and economic background that you're building on top of. Colonial American societies are literally the most modern forms of commercial society implanted overnight. Meaning, while commercial society has arisen in Western Europe, it has only risen against the deep background, 1,000-year background of feudal society slowly going into decline and decaying. So in Western Europe, there are great religious establishments that dominate countries and want to persecute religious minorities. There are great aristocracies and nobilities that demand their particular privileges and their caste and hereditary rights. There are great monarchies that demand their absolute power and not having to deal with checks and balances on their authority. Commercial society emerges against that background, whereas
commercial society emerges in America, and the people are not constrained by popes or kings or aristocrats or the local lord. But fast forward to today, you still have those powers in Europe. You still have those powers in Europe that are going to want their piece of the action, if not to control the whole game. This is where the terms like synarchy come in, where these combinations behind the scenes of ancient powers like the Catholic Church and proto new fascist movements. The Spain might be a good example with Franco. Italy with Mussolini. The idea of working with the existing powers, it does not constrain people like Benjamin Franklin. And so this new type of society can emerge without those old shackles.
In colonial British North America, commercial society is implanted beyond the slave plantations from the very beginning. Those family farmers that dot the landscape of much of colonial British North America are free. They are in no way bondsmen. They are in no way serfs. They are able, even though they're mostly producing for the subsistence of their families, they're able to work harder and smarter to calculate how to buy goods on the market. And so by the mid-18th century, even the backcountry of the West, pictured here, is deeply ensconced in global commercial trading networks. You can go to the backcountry of Virginia, and there are roads that are going to take you right into coastal Virginia, which are again going to be protected by the Royal Navy, that is access to the world seas, and there are commodities flowing in and out. So there are porcelains and pottery coming from Asia. There are manufactured goods coming from Great Britain. There's tea and coffee. We can see even amongst quite humble family farmers across the 13 colonies by the mid-18th century, a whole series of goods that are produced in Britain or Europe, and even in some cases beyond in Asia and elsewhere. So these farmers are free laborers. They're free farmers that can mostly set the course of their own life, and they're ensconced in local trading networks. They go into town to get certain things they need and come back home. Those local trading networks are ensconced in regional networks, connecting them to the coasts, the well-settled eastern coasts, and those eastern coasts are, through the Royal Navy and the British state, connected to global networks of trade with Europe and trade with Asia. So essentially, you have the most purely developing commercial society in colonial British North America beyond the slave plantations. You don't have any existing feudal forms. You do not have the great religious establishments, the huge cathedrals and churches that dauntingly shadow the landscape throughout Western Europe. You don't have the vast standing armies and garrisons and fortifications that exist all throughout Western Europe. You don't have the all-powerful centralized monarchies with tax collectors and surveyors and intendants that exist in Western Europe. The whole apparatus of the old world, i.e. Western Europe, doesn't really exist to any degree in the New World. But what it does develop in the New World is this civil society that is emerging against the West, against a deep medieval background. But it's emerging in North America, not against any medieval background. So it has the most thoroughgoing development. And although slavery is a vital and important part of the colonial American economy in the 17th century with tobacco production, and slavery again becomes a vital part of the United States economy in the early 19th century with cotton textile production, if you simply look at the 18th century, 1700 to the American Revolution, where the real dynamism is in the free laboring parts of colonial British North America. You have the greatest demographic expansion in the history of the world prior to the Industrial Revolution in colonial British North America. In 1700, the free population of colonial British North America was less than 200,000 people. On the eve of the revolution, it's 2.5 million people. It's 2.5 million people who have a higher per capita income than Britain, which had been the richest country in the world in the 18th century. That is an incredibly dynamic development that hasn't been seen before. If any of you are interested in tracing this, just read Benjamin Franklin's autobiography. Benjamin Franklin is an exceptional figure in many ways. He's obviously a genius. I'm not denying that to him. But if you read his autobiography and you look at the kind of life he lives, initially in Boston and then going to Philadelphia and all of that, he is clearly taking advantage of opportunities that are being made by this unprecedented growth of civil society, of a civil associational world of people freely exchanging goods and services, freely meeting to form civic associations, to freely consent and do things together collectively that they can't do on their own, forming reading clubs, meeting at pubs, meeting at coffee houses, debating, discussing, producing newspapers, producing pamphlets. Benjamin Franklin comes out of that whole world that is driven by the development of free labor and commercial society and ultimately civil society in colonial British North America. He takes advantages of it, he exploits opportunities, and he realizes its potentials better than anyone else. He is aware of two things by the mid-18th century. One, in his observations concerning the increase of mankind, he's aware of how rapidly the free laboring population is expanding in colonial British North America, that it will sometime in the 19th century overtake Britain itself. And two, he's also aware that that will require a kind of political re-adjudication of the British Empire, right? Like, how do we make this empire work given its real seat of dynamism is now across the Atlantic? Okay, he's a great example of precisely these developments and phenomenon. Now, I don't want to belabor this point too much, but what I want to kind of try and just get across is a sense in which there are levels of civil freedom. And by civil freedom, I don't just mean individual rights. Sometimes we're too focused on individualism. There are a lot of individual rights in the colonies, but there are a whole series of social collective rights, because you don't need to have coercion to have the state, to have a collective activity, forming a business enterprise, forming a church, forming a voluntary association, forming a firefighting service, forming a street lighting service, forming a reading club, forming a debating society. All these kinds of things Franklin did are collective life where people freely consent to come together and organize their own lives. All right. So by the mid 18th century, because of unintentional reasons to do with the availability of land, not only does the free population of colonial British North America have the greatest enfranchisement in the world, right? Across all 13 colonies, more than 50% of adult males meet the property qualifications to vote. But it's not just the political right to exercise a vote. I also want to emphasize this freedom of daily life, this freedom where you can meet other people and you can work together to achieve ends that you can't achieve on your own, right? To form churches, to form civil associations, to form firefighting groups, to form reading clubs, what have you. And that whole world is a new experience of freedom, right? So there's the traditional story, which I completely agree with, that you have to understand that the enfranchisement of colonial adult males is much greater than anywhere else in the world because of accidental reasons to do with land availability. But beyond that, once you realize this is the most dynamic free labor commercial society developing in the world, you can also see there's other forms of freedom in daily life, from people exchanging goods and services, interacting, debating, discussing, cooperating, determining the course of their own lives and coming together to determine the course of their lives together.
And that is something that we have been losing over my lifetime. Started before that. When you see a character like J. Edgar Hoover, whose real purpose is to protect the old wealth, and you see them creating things like IntelPro, where they will actually go to that reading club and infiltrate it with FBI agents and then try to finger somebody that has communist sympathies, for example. Then you're undermining this civil society, and we lose things like kids clubs and bridge clubs and things that have the ability to introduce people to one another and share what we all really share is like 90% of our values are all the same in this country. And instead of that, they produce this media and these two political parties throwing all kinds of accusations back and forth, distracting us from our civil society and drawing us into a kind of a computerized, individualized relationship with government, which is the end of civil society as we see it coming.
Experience in colonial North America, not just of self-government in the sense of exercising a vote, but self-government as in figuring out how you want to live your life and setting the course of your own existence. And that's made possible by this whole collective development of free labor, commercial society, and civil society. Now, that brings us to the mid 18th century. That's the backdrop story. Now I'm going to tell a very rapid story. I know that everybody who comes to events at the American Revolution Institute probably has a lot of familiarity with the coming of the American Revolution. So forgive me for going over some ground that's probably quite familiar to you, but this will be the second half of the talk. Essentially, in the 1750s, in 1754, we have the beginning of massive global warfare between Great Britain, or Whig Britain, and Bourbon France, the France of the monarchy of Louis XV. Of course, this war breaks out a couple of years earlier. It breaks out between the British and French East India Company in 1754, 1755 in Asian waters and Asian lands, principally around the Indian subcontinent. And then, of course, it breaks out in 1754 in the Ohio River Valley with the beginning of the French and Indian War. And then 2 years later, it becomes official in Europe with the 7 Years' War. And the 7 Years' War is a massive global war between Britain and France. What I want to stress about this war right now is its incredible, incredible scope and scale. If you're sitting in London or you're sitting in Versailles, you're not like another European ruler, right? The 7 Years' War involves Russia, it involves Sweden, it involves Spain, it involves Austria, it involves many European countries. But if you're in London and Versailles, you look at the world not simply as a European chessboard, but a global chessboard. Because not only do you have European allies, the British crown has Prussia and Portugal, the French crown has Spain, Austria, Russia, but both of these crowns have non-European allies. They have Native American indigenous allies in the Americas, and they have South Asian allies on the Indian subcontinent. And they're fighting this global struggle against one another. And in order to wage it, they have to send men and material around the globe. They have to have supply lines that are unprecedented in the history of the world. right? They both send their navies around the southern tip of Africa, the Cape of Good Hope, to fight in Asian waters. They both send armies across the Atlantic to fight in the Americas, right? To fight in New France and to fight in colonial British North America, not simply in Europe, where of course they have extensive supply lines and logistical difficulties they face. All of this war requires immense expenditure, which means that you have to raise taxes on your population. But if you raise taxes on your population, you're going to get resistance and revolts, which indeed Britain does have tax riots during the war, and France has peasant uprisings during the war. So you've got to raise deferred taxes, i.e. debt. You've got to raise debt and earmark future taxes to pay the interest on that debt. The problem.
And I want to stop and just really emphasize this point. You've got to raise taxes, or you've got to borrow. And when you borrow, you are borrowing against future taxes that you intend to extract. When we have a government that has borrowed $37 trillion, you can bet that if they're ever going to pay it, they're going to pay it through extracting more and more taxes from the common people. That's the only source that they have.
With that, though, is both Britain and France are accumulating massive amounts of debt during the war. On the British side, you go in 1756 from 70 million pounds sterling spent to in 1760 almost doubling it at 130 million pounds sterling spent, which is, nobody thought you could break through those records in the 18th. We're used to that now, but nobody in the 18th century thought you could break through those records. And so by the end of this war, even though Britain wins it convincingly between the late 1750s and the early 1760s, and ultimately is the victor at the peace settlement in Paris in February 1763, nevertheless, it has a massive increase in debt. And because of its increase in debt, it's got a massive increase in the interest payments it has to pay to people who have subscribed to the public debt, because nobody is confident anymore they're going to repay the debt anytime soon. So they're charging much higher interest rates because basically lenders to the government are taking on much greater risk. And furthermore, taxes on the population are quite high. They try and raise an excise tax on cider at the end of the war, and there's a massive revolt in the West Country, the apple-growing, cider-producing West Country, against this because the people are already quite highly taxed. Furthermore, their economy has been destroyed in a war. Their sons have been impressed, forcefully sent off to fight in the war, and essentially they don't have any money to pay, and now their taxes are being increased. So by the end of that war, the British ministry faces a considerable dilemma, a very, very, very considerable dilemma, which is effectively that it must find new sources of revenue. It must find new sources of revenue, not necessarily to immediately pay down debt, but at least to signal to debt holders that they're good for the debt in the long run.
A signal to debt holders that they are good in the long run. I think that's a lot of our manufactured crises today. Things like we're doing now with this naval mission to Venezuela, things that look like we're taking care of the economy, at least so that the big guys, the corporations and the big banks, they're going to get their cut. And so to create the impression that everything is fine, and if it's not, we're going to go out with our military and kick some ass, gives comfort to those people that sit in their luxury and enjoy their lives. I'm going to skip ahead now. These characters on the screen there, that's William Pitt the Elder and John Wilkes. You may know both of them. You certainly find a lot of places in America named after them. You have these guys are the British guys that are favoring the argument that Americans are making, no taxation without representation. And you see now the picture that the last part of this presentation is going to flesh out, because to me, I've always wondered what was the relationship between the British East India Company and the American Revolution. And I think we're going to find that this lecture here satisfies us as to what was really going on. I'm going to skip forward to, let's see. Oh, I hate to miss this part. Let's see. So, as you know, the British decide that they're going to impose the Townshend Act, and the British are going to send troops to the United States to occupy our cities to make sure that we don't rebel. And then they're going to send their own royal agents to come and be our governors, as opposed to the governors chosen for many decades through colonial assemblies, such as the House of Burgesses in Virginia and the meetings, the assemblies of New England. All right, so now we're going to go to the last part of the lecture. This deals with exactly that question. The making of British Bengal, Clive's acquisition of the Diwani in 1865, and you can see in the picture there is the Mughal emperor giving that paper to Clive.
From London in Calcutta in Bengal, and he then travels up country to Allahabad, the Mughal capital, and meets this gentleman on this makeshift throne here, who is the Mughal Emperor Shah Alam II. And the Mughal Emperor Shah Alam II gives Robert Clive a piece of paper, which is the Diwani Grant. The Diwani Grant is the right to collect taxes and revenues to give law and order and to maintain jurisdiction in Bengal. Effectively, with this act, when Mughal Emperor Shah Alam II hands Robert Clive this Diwani, what's happening is Shah Alam II is giving Robert Clive, and through Robert Clive, the British East India Company, effective sovereignty over 3 provinces in the Mughal Empire: northeastern India, Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa. And the British East India Company is going to use those sovereign powers to go back to Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa, and to collect taxes from Bengali peasants, and use the money from those taxes to pay Bengali spinners, weavers, and manufacturers for the goods they make, and then take those goods and sell them in Europe. So effectively, the British East India Company, when it becomes a territorial empire through this act by Robert Clive, is essentially transforming into a sovereign state in northeastern India. And this sovereign state has a bureaucracy and a military that is in no way accountable to the population it rules over. Meaning what Robert Clive and the British East India Company build in northeastern India and Bengal in the late 1760s is what they themselves call an Oriental despotism, by which they mean a bureaucracy that can assess wealth and collect taxes, and an army that can collect those taxes if the peasants don't pay them, and that can wage war. And that bureaucracy and that military are in no way accountable to the population over which they rule. There's not a single court any Bengali peasant can go to sue for something a British bureaucrat or a British officer has done here in the Clive era. There's not a single representative assembly where the elites, the Zamindari landed elites in Bengal, can go and bring the grievances from the localities and tell people, hey, your policy, your taxes are too high, they're hurting the economy. There's nothing like that. So what you have to realize is the year the Stamp Act is being passed in 1765, the British East India Company has basically created a territorial empire in northeastern India that is a bureaucratic and military despotism. It can collect taxes as it sees fit. It can spend those taxes on what it wants. It's buying as a private corporation. It's buying the goods it sells back to Europe. So it's a drain of wealth on the Bengali economy. And the standing army isn't accountable to the society over which it operates at all. Why was this allowed to happen? This was allowed to happen because this gentleman, Robert Clive, got the backing of King George III and George Grenville and the group of conservatives who were extremely worried about the fiscal and political crisis afflicting Britain at the end of the 7 Years' War. I know I've told you guys a lot of things, I apologize, but let me try and draw it all together. If you go back to the end of the 7 Years' War, there's a huge fiscal and political crisis in Britain. They need alternative sources of revenue. It looks like the British East India Company in Bengal is on the verge of collapse. It's been fighting the French. It's been fighting South Asian indigenous forces. Calcutta was at one point captured by the Nawab of Bengal. And essentially, Robert Clive sells the conservative political circles in Britain in the early 1760s on the idea that if you create a territorial empire, a unaccountable bureaucracy and military in Bengal, you can get revenues from the Bengali population that will stabilize the British East India Company. And if you stabilize the British East India Company, you will stabilize a public creditor back in Britain and a key player on the London financial market. And if the British East India Company does well, if it can extract wealth from Bengali peasants because it's got a bureaucracy and a military that can extract wealth without at all being held to account or having to deal with the people from whom it's extracting wealth, if it can do that really well, it can increase shareholder dividends. It can increase salary to the directors of the East India Company. And the shareholders and directors of the East India Company are some of the major lenders and grantors of money to the government. So this is why, in the midst of a fiscal and political crisis in Britain, these conservative forces around King George III and George Grenville support Clive's idea of returning and basically transforming the British East India Company into a territorial empire that can collect revenue from a population that can't hold the East India Company accounts and can stabilize the East India Company situation and potentially deliver future profits and revenue to the British state. And it's not just me. There are many, many, many members of the colonial American resistance movement who put 2 and 2 together and say just this. Let me give you a couple of examples. So this takes us now towards the conclusion. All right, so basically, I don't know how much detail should go into, but I'll say very quickly, because of the Stamp Act, there are massive riots across colonial North America from New Hampshire to Georgia. George Grenville falls as prime minister, and a much more compromising, moderate prime minister, the Marquis of Rockingham, comes to power. And the Marquis of Rockingham decides that practically they're going to repeal the Stamp Act, but theoretically they're going to uphold the Stamp Act. What does that mean? Well, basically that's something pictured here called the Declaratory Act that's passed in 1766, meaning the same month that Parliament repeals the Stamp Act for practical purpose, they passed the Declaratory Act saying Parliament theoretically, constitutionally had the right to do everything it did in the new imperial policies. So Rockingham is saying, yes, you're upset about the Stamp Act, colonists, we'll repeal it, but theoretically we have the right to do it, and if need be down the road, we can do it again. And sure enough, the Marquess of Rockingham falls from power. A coalition ministry comes into power in 1766. And eventually, a year later, this gentleman pictured here on the left, Charles Townshend, the most important financial minister in the government, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, decides that he's going to try and do everything George Grenville did with the Stamp Act, except through the back door. The genius, the kind of mad genius of Charles Townshend is, okay, the colonists claim they're upset with the direct tax on them. And therefore, I, Charles Townshend, am going to pass the Townshend Acts, which leads to what we call the Townshend duties, which basically are taxes at colonial ports on imports coming in from Europe, right? Taxes that the colonists have to pay, duties they have to pay on lead, on paint, on glass, on paper, and tea, amongst other goods. So Townshend believes he's escaped the problem by putting it as an indirect tax collected at colonial ports on imports rather than a direct tax internally taxed within the colonies. But Townshend wants to do the exact same thing Grenville wanted to do. He wants to pay for all of imperial officialdom, the judges, the royal governors, the tax collectors, with the Townshend duties, which means what Townshend is again trying to do, what the British government is again trying to do, is effectively to raise a tax. British Parliament is raising the Townshend duties. It doesn't have a single representative from the American colonies in it. It doesn't consult or get the approval of a single colonial assembly or agent. It raises these indirect taxes, these Townshend duties at colonial ports, and it's using them for the exact same purpose Grenville wanted to use it for, which is to pay for all of imperial officialdom. So meaning what the Townshend duties pose is exactly what the Stamp Act posed, that all of imperial officialdom, all the officers, all the judges, all the governors, all the tax collectors would no longer be concerned about what the colonial assemblies wanted and what their popular constituents wanted. Rather, they would be concerned about what the British Parliament wanted, which meant they would be concerned about what the British landed elite, the bewigged aristocrats and gentlemen wanted. Unsurprisingly, you get the renewal of the imperial crisis. Massive protests, non-importation agreements break out again in the late 1760s. And as a result, Prime Minister Lord North, who comes into power in 1770, decides he wants to quiet this situation, and he decides effectively to eliminate all of the Townshend duties except for the one on tea. Why does he keep the one on tea? He keeps it because he wants to uphold the principle of Parliament's absolute sovereign authority over the colonies. He wants to uphold the principle that there is no necessary link between taxation and representation. Why? Because Lord North is a conservative, and he points out to many people in the British elite, if we cede to the colonists their principle of no taxation without representation, what about all the people here that we tax half to death that aren't represented at all? London, the biggest city in Europe, 2 representatives in Parliament. Manchester and Birmingham, 50,000 people headed towards a couple of 100,000, dynamic manufacturing sectors, not a single member of Parliament. Old Sarum, 16 village inhabitants, 2 members of Parliament. It's an entirely unrepresentative system. So Lord North does not want to cede the principle of taxation has to be linked to actual representation, and he does not want to cede the idea that Parliament doesn't have absolute sovereignty over the colonies. That's vital for him. Now, because I realize I'm coming up to my time limit, I would just like to read you guys a couple of quotes. This is from the most famous pamphlet produced in the colonial American resistance movement during the crisis of the later 1760s, provoked by the Townshend duties. It's by John Dickinson. I've already mentioned him. He writes letters from a farmer in Pennsylvania to the inhabitants of the British colonies. And in there he says, the East India Company's conduct in Asia for some years past has given ample proof how little they regard the laws of nations, the rights, liberties, or lives of men. They have levied war, excited rebellions, dethroned princes, and sacrificed millions for the sake of gain. The revenue of mighty kingdoms have centered in their coffers. And these not being sufficient to glut their avarice, they have, by the most unparalleled barbarities, extortions, and monopolies, stripped the miserable inhabitants of their property and reduced whole provinces to poverty and ruin. They now, it seems, cast their eyes to America as a new theater whereon to exercise their talents of rapine, oppression, and cruelty. The monopoly of tea is, I dare say, but a small part of the plan they have formed to strip us of our property. Many people, Dickinson is the most famous example, but many people are pointing out this in the colonial American resistance movement, right? Okay, British ministers and officials say that they don't have a plan for slavery. Remember, slavery means not what we understand plantation slavery. Slavery means that the state is not accountable to the civil society, to the community over which it rules. That's what they mean by slavery. And
That is such an important point. I have to stop and say that again. Slavery does not mean plantation slavery or chattel slavery in the context of the Patriots of that era. What it means is that there's no relationship between the government above you and yourself, and that you are basically a commodity that can be pushed around, overtaxed, and just like the unfortunate people of Bengal can have your entire society destroyed, cities destroyed, families, clans that work together over millennia, as it happened in Vietnam. They understood that that's what the British Empire does to its colonial people. And I think it's a very, very important point that Professor Vaughan makes here, is that Americans knew it. Dickinson knew it. Franklin knew it. They saw, they read the papers, they understood exactly what this financial crisis in Britain, that they had run up their debt in order to beat the French. The French ran up their debt at the same time, and it was, it becomes a question of whose financing lasts the longest, right? The idea of a boot stamping on the neck of humanity forever, which Orwell gives us, was the same idea that the Patriots saw when they considered what this empire will do when it starts to need some money.
Will point out the colonial American resistance movement. If you don't have a plan for slavery in the British Empire, if you don't have a plan to raise the state beyond accountability to the population over which it rules, why are you accepting what's going on in Bengal? Why are you accepting what's going on in India? That is a pure despotism if there ever has been one, right? There, many colonial American resistance leaders point out, taxation without representation is an accomplished fact. The Bengali peasant population is tax, 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 without a single representative. There's not a newspaper, there's not a petition, there's not a court they can go to, there's not an assembly where they can seek redress, there's no checks on the imperial bureaucracy or the army whatsoever. And basically, this is the situation in 1770 when Lord North decides to remove the Townsend duties to quiet the crisis. And so to take things to a conclusion, basically, that's how things lie for about 3 years. But then we're back at where we began, right? We're back at where we began, the problem of the Tea Act. Lord North faces this difficulty, which is the British East India Company is on the verge of bankruptcy. Why? Because their extractive and monopolistic policies have been ruinous in Bengal. They've led to famine. They've led to undermining the goose that lays the golden egg. I mean, I can't get into the details, but the British East India Company is using its political power in the late 1760s to impose a monopsony on Bengal, meaning merchants and manufacturers in Bengal who want to sell goods have to preferentially sell them to the British East India Company, which means that the prices aren't being determined by the market, they're being determined by the East India Company. And that's economically ruinous. It's destroying the well springs of Indian life and the economy, and it's in turn going to make it harder for them to pay revenues to the British East India Company, to taxes. And so the whole British East India Company is spiraling out of control by the late 60s, early 70s, and it's on the verge of bankruptcy. And if it goes bankrupt, the biggest multinational corporation, one of the biggest holders of government debt, one of the biggest players on the London stock market will crash. This is too big to fail on steroids. And
too big to fail on steroids. Wow. That's the picture in 1773, 4, 5, that Americans who pay attention, and certainly that is the merchant class and as well as the big landowners, see as a real possibility with these armies coming to occupy and make sure that we pay our taxes, with crown agents in all the ports to extract the taxes, and with the British Navy escorting the ships. It all is an extension of the immense amount of wealth held by the elites in Britain and their power over the government and the king and the parliament to use the colonies however they would want to use them. Fortunately, by some incredible coincidence, enough people were aware of this, were able to see it coming, and to enjoying the civil society that has been created by this commercial wealth, to organize and to assert the rights that they considered to be liberty.
so Lord North steps in with this act, the Tea Act, right? And that Tea Act, although it seems banal and simple enough when the Prime Minister and his cabinet passes it through the British House of Commons and the House of Lords, and King George signs it on May the 10th, 1773, making it effective, it signals two things to the colonists. One, there's going to be full support for the British East India Company and everything it's doing in Bengal, which means that an important part of the British Empire has been lost to liberty. That's their understanding. I'm not saying they're right or wrong. That's their understanding, that there is a plan for slavery that has been realized in Bengal. right? Now, British say it's our conditions, it's imposed on us, we can't rule in any other way, but that's the view of many leaders of the colonial American resistance movement, that a plan for slavery has been realized in Bengal, and British ministers are willing to do anything to uphold the British East India Company. Look, they passed the Tea Act. Therefore, they're committed to this empire, not of consent, not of liberty, but of coercion and domination. Two, the other thing it signals to the colonial American population is, they are really doubling down on this Townsend duty on tea. That isn't just like a little fig leaf. They are going to make the East India Company pay it. They're going to make tea salespeople pay it. And therefore, they're going to establish the principle of Parliament can tax the colonists without having a single representative in the colonists in Parliament in London. Parliament is going to tax the colonists through this duty on tea, right? Because the Tea Act is a doubling down on the duty on tea. Parliament is going to tax the colonists without consulting their colonial assemblies. So this is what the colonial American resistance movement essentially has in its minds, right? They're backing a despotic empire in Bengal, and they're allowing the East India Company to establish a presence in North America. And in establishing that presence, they're doubling down on the tea duty, which is a doubling down on the idea of an absolute parliamentary authority to tax the colonies without representing them in any way, shape, or form. That is, the future is going to be basically taxation without representation, a state that is not accountable to the people over whom it governs. And that is going to lead, right, to the event that Andrew tells me you'll be coming here to hear another lecture about. Hopefully didn't go over time as badly as I did, on the Boston Tea Party in December 16th, 1773, right, which triggers the renewal of the imperial crisis and ultimately leads to essentially the total breakdown of imperial authority and the end, more or less, of the British Empire in North America. I would like to leave you, if your patience would bear, with one quote. It's from a radical member of the British House of Commons named George Dempster. He had been a follower of William Pitt, the Earl of Chatham, and he's trying to point out to his fellow members of the House of Commons in 1775 how they got themselves in this situation. George Dempster is a political radical. He wants the reform of Parliament. He's a friend of America. He's against the American war. And he's trying to tell his fellow members of the British House of Commons how they got to this situation. He writes, he says on the floor of the Commons, this is on October 27, 1775, "In my conscience, I think the claim of the Americans is just and well-founded, to be left in the free exercise of the right of taxing themselves in her several provincial assemblies, in the same manner that Ireland now does and always has done. By this beautiful part of our Constitution, our wise ancestors have bound together the different and distant parts of this mighty empire. By this single principle heretofore inviolate, they have diffused in a most unexampled manner the blessings of liberty and good government through our remotest provinces. Look, sir, into the history of the provinces of other states, of the Roman Empire in ancient times, of the French, Spanish, Dutch, and Turkish provinces of more modern date, and you will find every page of it stained with acts of oppressive violence, of cruelty, injustice, and peculation. But in the British provinces, the annual meetings of their little assemblies have constantly restrained the despotism and corrected the follies of their governance. They watch over the administration of justice and from time to time enact such salutary regulations as tend to promote their happiness and well-being. And what, sir, I beseech you, could ensure the regular meetings of those assemblies, ever troublesome to governors, but they're retaining in their own hands, like us at home, the power of granting the funds necessary for defraying the current expense of government. Were your provincial assemblies deprived of this power, I cannot see wherein the government of America would differ in any way from that of India. And has our inquiries in a former session into the administration of Bengal made us in love with the Eastern species of government we have created? Do we seriously wish to transplant that rapine, despotism, and cruelty in India to America? Thank you, and thank you. Sorry for trespassing on your time.
All right, Professor James Vaughan, University of Chicago, speaking at the American Revolution Institute in 2023. I hope this helps to reinvigorate an understanding of who we are, of who our roots are, what our American political philosophy is really bound to, and that is civil society, the ability to join and make new organizations, to get a bunch of people together and build a city or a barn or a water system or whatever those people need to pursue their own happiness. And the idea of an empire, which still exists today and is pressing very, very hard on hundreds of different fronts against our civil society, against our working together as free people, is the liberty that our Constitution, our Declaration of Independence, and our Bill of Rights together guarantee to us as long as we can keep it. All right. I enjoyed it. I hope you did. I'll see you guys tomorrow with Marcia for our weekly wrap-up, 11 a.m. Eastern Time. McDuff and Marcia, and we'll be taking our usual tour through the live chat. Hope you can join us. Bye now.